Every tragedy begins as an ordinary day. No thunderclap, no warning, just life repeating itself until one small thing breaks. Daniel was 30, halfway between ambition and exhaustion. He worked construction on the outskirts of the city, lived for Friday pay and weekend sleep. Friends called him reliable, stubborn, humorous in a rough sort of way. He'd never been arrested, never thrown a punch outside school. But ordinary doesn't mean safe. Stress had been stacking like bricks, tight deadlines, broken machinery, bills arriving too early. That evening, he clocked off later than usual, shoulders heavy, mind buzzing with half-imagined arguments from work. At the pub, music thumped through ceiling dust. One beer became two, became four. Conversations blurred, pride inflated. The kind of gentle intoxication that convinces a man he's right about everything. Outside, the night was cool. Neon light reflected in puddles, little mirrors of distraction. Daniel's keys clinked in his hand. His phone buzzed with a message he ignored. That's when the small misunderstandings began. A stranger brushed his shoulder too hard. Someone laughed. It wasn't much, just noise, but noise layered on stress and alcohol can sound like insult. In that half-minute, something uncoiled inside him. A human fuse that millions carry quietly every day, pride waiting for a spark. The spark lands, and the language of logic becomes primitive. What we call temper isn't born in the moment. It's a habit of unspent frustration, collecting interest, until it demands payment. Daniel didn't know that. He thought he was just tired. He finished his drink, started walking toward the car park, heart hammering faster than it should. Streetlights strobed against the windscreen of his park sedan. Music leaked from another bar down the road. One song he used to like now sounded mocking. Somewhere between the door and the ignition key, he would meet someone else under fluorescent light. They wouldn't be enemies, not yet. But they'd trade a few words that mattered less than the consequences that followed. Later, psychologists would dissect every variable, alcohol, fatigue, pride, reaction time, and discover how predictably ordinary men become statistics. At that moment, there was only a man in a jacket, tired eyes, shallow breath, ready to cross the invisible line between frustration and catastrophe. The story that begins with small talk, noise, and neon will end in silence and paperwork. A case file marked manslaughter. But for now, it's just Friday night, and he believes he'll sleep well. It happened in less time than anyone later spent describing it. A reversing car, a horn, a few shouted words that were too loud for how small the insult really was. Daniel stopped mid-stride, already halfway home in his head, and turned around. His pulse rose without asking permission. The driver, a stranger about his age, leaned out the window. "Watch where you're going." Daniel's brain misheard that as "you think you own the road." Pride translated harmless noise into challenge. He stepped toward the bumper. Steam rose from a nearby drain. The night smelled of fuel and beer. "Say that again," he said, "because that's what men who can't walk away usually say." Adrenaline is faster than reason. The hormone spikes in 2 seconds, floods in 4. The prefrontal cortex, the part that calculates consequence, goes temporarily dim. Scientists call this amygdala hijack. Policemen call it the moment. Daniel's heart slammed at 140 beats per minute. Vision tunneled, ears rang. The driver opened his door to stand his ground. 2 bodies squared up under the fluorescent streetlight that painted everything in cold white. There wasn't a plan, only energy looking for release. Daniel's hand moved before thought caught up, a quick forward motion fueled by months of swallowed frustration. A strike, open-handed, but with weight behind it. The other man stumbled back. One sound, skull concrete. Then silence, startled and huge. The adrenaline high lasted long enough for Daniel to whisper, "You all right?" Then the sight of stillness hit him harder than the punch itself. People ran. Phone screens lit the alley blue. Someone shouted, "Call an ambulance." Daniel backed up, hands shaking like he was freezing in the warm air. A woman pressed tissue to the victim's head. Blood bloomed darker than the pavement. He didn't run. He couldn't. He kept hearing the echo of that single impact. The victim's chest moved once, then less, then not at all. Later, police body cams would record Daniel's first sentence. "I was just trying to scare him." Paramedics would record time of death, 11:42 p.m. Between those two timestamps lived the 5 seconds that changed dozens of lives. His, the victims, their families, strangers who'd witness it for nightmares to come. Human beings spend entire careers studying intent, crime, justice. None of them can stretch 5 seconds back into innocence. Daniel sat on the curb while officers arrived, head in hands, still whispering like a prayer. "I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." The street light flickered once, as if confirming nothing ever stops, because one man's world has. Sunlight hurts in police holding cells. It drips through glass blocks and squares, too bright for memory. Daniel's head throbbed. His tongue tasted of metal and regret. Every movement around him, the scrape of a chair, the slam of a door, sounded like judgment echoing off concrete. At 8:30 a.m., a detective slid a coffee across the table. The paper cup trembled in Daniel's hand. Caffeine wouldn't fix anything. Opposite him, a recorder blinked red. "Let's start from the beginning," the officer said. He started 2 hours too late. The beginning was always before the first word of anger. His statement came in fragments. Anger, confusion. "He came at me. I didn't mean to hurt him." Every modern interrogation room carries the same ghost of repetition. Regret replayed on loop. The detective explained gently but firmly, the victim didn't survive. Daniel didn't speak for 12 seconds. Then one quiet word. "No." In law, gaps like that become evidence of awareness. Prosecutors will later read it from transcripts, describing visible signs of emotional response. Courts catalog even grief. Formalities followed. The arrest reread fingerprints, charging document. Murder was scratched out. Manslaughter replaced it in neat type. To a layman, both mean destruction. To law, they're divided by intention. Murder asks, "Did you want to kill?" Manslaughter asks, "Were you reckless enough not to care?" He thought about the second question, because he didn't like its accuracy. That afternoon, he appeared before a magistrate for a bail hearing. Press waited outside, cameras eager for a face to match their headline. "One-punch death in city car park." In the dock, he looked smaller, as though gravity had found him heavier than science allowed. The judge spoke calmly, granting conditional bail, surrender passport, report daily, abstain from alcohol. He nodded again, that same numb reflex of men who no longer control what happens next. Outside court, a reporter called his name. Flashbulbs burst. Light sprayed across his pupils like punishment. He didn't look up. The world, once endless with Friday night laughter, now felt the size of his breath. That night at home, he stared at his bathroom mirror, eyes red like someone else's reflection. The television news showed the street from a drone's angle. White tent, police tape flapping. He realized stories always need villains and victims, and he had become a villain without meaning to audition. He turned off the sound, but not before hearing the phrase, "Family demands justice." That sentence sank more brutally than the verdict waiting months away. He crawled into bed and dreamt of hands pressing down on his shoulders, whispering, 5 seconds. Each whisper heavier than the one before until it crushed sleep itself. By morning, he stopped using the word accident. Accidents don't happen with fists. They happen with stares and rain and broken glass. This was something else. A choice too quick to count yet slow enough to remember forever. The sentencing came 10 months later. Daniel stood inside the glass enclosure of a courtroom, tie slightly crooked, hands shaking around a copy of a letter he'd written to the victim's family. He never got to read it aloud. The prosecutor's summary filled every corner of the room with cold, correct language. The judge's voice moved slowly. Facts first, feelings second. No history of violence. High level of remorse. Nevertheless, a death. 10 years, the gavel said without emotion. Non-parole 6 years, 8 months. He heard the number the way people hear the ocean, inside a shell, distant, but inescapable. Prison intake smelled of disinfectant and resignation. He traded cotton shirt for green uniform, laces for elastic. His cell was a 6-step rectangle, half cement, half echo. The door closed and a mechanical hiss became the background to everything he'd ever valued. Time breaks differently inside. Days flatten until the calendar looks like static. Weeks start as Monday and end as Monday again. Daniel learned early that survival wasn't about toughness, but rhythm. Wake at 5. Count. Clean. Wait. In anger management class, a counselor drew a triangle on the board. Trigger, feeling, action. Then she asked, "Where could you have stopped?" He stared at the whiteboard until it blurred. "Anywhere," he whispered. He met others who carried stories nearly identical to his. The man whose brother's mockery turned fatal. The father whose teenage son shoved him during an argument and never saw him get up. They spoke quietly, sentences ending with, "And now I'm here." Remorse made them softer than their mugshot suggested. At night, the prison softened too. Electric lights hummed lullabies of consequence. He'd lie awake, replaying that 5-second loop. The words, the step forward, the motion, the fall. He couldn't stop editing it in his mind, trying to splice some imaginary version where he walked away. Mail arrived once a week. Some pages from his mother, one from an old friend who wrote, "We still remember the good version of you." He folded that letter like a life preserver. After the first year, he joined the library work detail. Bookshelf dust smelled like forgiveness. Paper didn't stare. Through reading, he learned the obvious truth that anger shortens vision the way fog hides distance. Friends inside called him professor because he always explained laws and sentences to newcomers. He said, "I'm not smart. I just had too much time to study, regret." The calendar pages began to matter again around year 6, each marked by the knowledge that outside someone's family had an empty chair he'd created. He understood that counting the years wasn't punishment. It was accounting, the slow arithmetic of guilt. Silence changes people. At first it feels like punishment. Then it becomes a kind of mirror. In Woolston, noise was everywhere. Footsteps, radios, the iron breath of doors. But true silence began after lights out, when hundreds of voices turned inward at once. It was there Daniel started to listen, to himself, to echoes, to the thin voices that never faded, even when the world slept. He stopped saying, "Why me?" and started asking why at all. A counselor once told him remorse was healthy only if it grew into reform. Otherwise, it rotted into self-pity. So he signed up for a restorative justice program. It paired offenders with the families of victims, sometimes their own, more often strangers who wanted to understand. He didn't meet his victims' relatives directly. They declined. But he read the letters from other families and felt something shift. One mother wrote, "I don't want revenge. I want people like you to warn my son's friends before they do the same." Daniel carried that sentence folded in his shirt pocket for weeks. Eventually, he started teaching an anger management class himself. The officers assumed he'd quote the manual, but he brought his own line. "You're not bad people. You made bad seconds." Students listened in the way only inmates can, hearts behind walls, faces practiced in indifference, but eyes desperate to be believed. He told them about adrenaline, brain chemistry, impulse loops, the law. He repeated the same phrase until his throat hurt. Breathe. Walk away. Outside educators visited once a month. One of them, a social worker named Maya, brought data. 82% of one-punch offenders had no violent history. Every statistic she read was another mirror Daniel couldn't avoid. Silence taught him humility, but teaching taught him purpose. He realized prisons weren't just cages, they were warning sirens. If he could translate his failure into a caution, maybe that was the closest thing to repair left. After class, he would sometimes stand in the yard and watch the sky fade from orange to black. He'd imagine his victim's family doing the same under another horizon. He hoped they found some moment of peace unconnected to his name. When reporters occasionally toured the facility for reform documentaries, the officers pointed him out. That's Daniel. He helps with the education programs. They never said why he was there. Viewers called him the mentor instead of the killer. Labels, he learned, are just time in disguise. Year 8 slid into Year 9. Early parole was whispered between inmates as a rumor. He didn't count on it. He just kept teaching. Silence had done its work. He no longer needed noise to prove he was alive. The door that opens for release doesn't make a grand sound. It just clicks, like a switch reminding you how simple freedom can feel when you've spent years rehearsing regret. Daniel walked out carrying a box, 2 shirts, a worn paperback, and the folder of letters he'd never mailed. The sunlight felt heavier than he remembered. Too bright, too warm, almost suspicious. Outside air always smells like forgiveness until you realize it still expects proof. The halfway house manager drove him to a small apartment near the docks. Noise of traffic, seagulls, the city's pulse, it all felt foreign, like hearing language he'd forgotten. That week, he learned the world has no patience for hesitation. People moved faster, talked louder, stared at their screens more than their surroundings. Every raised voice made him flinch. Every news story about violence felt personal. But duty officers asked for plans, and he had one: speak, teach, warn. A community center invited him to share his experience with high school students. At first, he refused. No one wants a killer in a classroom. The coordinator replied, they don't need a killer. They need proof that 5 seconds are real. So he stood before teenagers one afternoon, hands sweating behind the lectern, and said, I ended a life because I refused to pause. I thought walking away would make me weak. It would have made me wise. He didn't show photos. He showed timelines. 5 seconds labeled choice. 10 years labeled cost. He explained how loss separates anger from intention. How prisons erase excuses, but not possibilities. When he finished, the room stayed silent. A teacher near the back wiped her eyes. Some students looked down at their shoes, imagining the arguments they'd carry differently now. Afterward, a boy approached and whispered, my brother's in jail for the same thing. Daniel nodded, not as counselor, but as mirror. Tell him time isn't punishment, he said. It's a classroom if you let it be. He kept speaking: schools, youth centers, construction sites, anywhere tempers brewed easily. Each talk reopened the wound, but also cleaned it. He realized healing isn't forgetting. It's retelling until the pain teaches instead of burns. Years later, when people asked what he learned, Daniel always answered the same way. Control is freedom. Walking away is not weakness. It's the highest form of strength. Because in every moment preceding violence, there's a pause hiding in plain sight, the quick breath that could change everything. He found peace not by forgiving himself, but by making those 5 seconds belong to anyone willing to listen. So if you ever feel your pulse spike, your hands tighten, every instinct telling you to strike, remember him. Remember that one heartbeat of patience can outweigh 10 years of silence. That's the real sentence. The story you heard isn't about guilt, it's about awareness. Every generation needs a reminder that our impulses are faster than our wisdom, but neither are stronger than choice. Pause once. Breathe once. That is all it takes to rewrite a lifetime. If this story reaches even one person at the edge of a bad decision, Daniel's years, the victim's loss, the pain that bound 2 families, none of it is wasted. So carry the lesson forward. Compassion before conflict. Reason before reaction. Life before pride.